evening, everybody who is joining us from different parts of the world today. My name is Iveta Silva, and I'm professor here at Arizona State University and also Associate Dean of Global Engagement. And I am thrilled today to co-host with many people this wonderful session on responsibilities of post-qualitative researchers. And this session is very unique, I think, in a couple of ways. First of all, because it's one of the first events that we are organizing in collaboration between Arizona State University and the University of Oulu. This has been a partnership in the works for the last, actually more than a year. And we are very happy to have Karen Morris actually with us in Arizona, in Phoenix today, this whole week. And just thrilled to have all of the people from different networks joining together. So a second thing that's unique about this session is that it's also an intersection of different networks. So we do have our colleagues here joining from Arizona State University and all of the intellectual networks that they bring together, but also it's a collaboration with the Postqualitative Research Collective that comes into the conversation with all these other networks. So it's very great opportunity for dialogues across disciplines, disciplinary boundaries, but also all kinds of other boundaries that we still deal in academia. So, but on this note, I would like to give the floor to my co-host, Professor Mirko Koro, who is also the Director of Doctoral Programs here at Arizona State University. So Mirko, over to you.
Thanks, Iveta. Welcome. Hyvää huomenta, hyvää iltapäivää, wherever you are. This is I'm really excited to participate in this conversation today and hear what our panelists have to say, and then what we all collectively come together around issues related to post-qualitative research and responsibility. And both of the concept, responsibility and post-qualitative research, are something that the panelists and many of us in this call have been puzzled about and puzzled with for some time now. And I think that the conversations today will speak to both kind of major concepts here today. How does post-qualitative operate? That's kind of like the underlining currents of all the conversations that will take place, because the space is the post-qual space. But then the responsibility adds another interesting layer about the ethics and the practices of post-qualitative research and researchers, and how can we do work collectively and responsible ways. And especially what does it mean now at the time of post-humanism and global crisis and sustainability education and discourses, and what needs to change and what should change in our research approaches and inquiry ways that we inquire when planet is destroying itself and all that stuff, and we are contributing to that. So very important and interesting conversations, and looking forward to hear from all of you today. I would like to really briefly introduce our fabulous speakers who have joined us around the world. I'll start with Karen. So those of you who don't know Karen is a professor of our early childhood education at the University of Oulu. Love Oulu and been there a few times. Also has been working at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She's from Amsterdam, but has mostly worked and lived in UK and Africa. And she's a teacher educator and philosopher, and very well grounded in a post-qualitative research paradigm. And research interests are philosophy and education, early childhood studies, ethics, and picture books. She's currently the principal investigator of responsible innovation in technology for children and the post-qualitative research in higher education collective. chief editor of the Roguelist, Postqualitative, New Materialist, and Critical Post-Humanist Research Series. And her latest book just got published with Springer and is called Karen Barat as Educator, Essential Realism and Education. And we had a very lovely conversation on Wednesday around those themes. So thanks, Karen, for that. Then we have Franz joining us, Franz Kruger, who is assistant professor in education at the University of Nottingham, UK. Prior to joining the University of Nottingham, Franz held a senior lectureship in philosophy and policy studies in education at the University of Free State, South Africa. In his research, he explores the intersections between education, socio-ecological justice, eco-justice, emergent research methodologies, and in particular, Franz is interested in how we can affirmatively respond to contemporary social and ecological concerns through education and educational research. And Franz, I'm really excited about your eco-justice work, and it's really, really fabulous. And Ture is joining us, Ture Tamme is joining us from Finland. Ture is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Oulu, affiliated with these really amazing projects that are called, just listen to the names, Animate, City Rats, and Fellow Feelings Project. And he's also a musician. He likes to explore the assemblages of multi-species childhoods and environmental education with post-human philosophies. His recent work has examined care, microbes, humor, and questions in child-animal relations. Currently, he's studying the impossibilities and possibilities of sound, speculative fiction, bioart, and insect thinking in finding pathways for non-anthropocentric education. Thanks, Ture, for joining us. Kiitos, ihanaa kuulla täällä. Okay, so now that's the introductions to our amazing speakers, and then we're gonna go about 5 minutes each. They will share their kind of preliminary thoughts, warm-up ideas, however you want, provocations, and then we have a little bit of dialogue after that. So we don't have any specific turns, so anybody can go. Any of you?
Wow.
Karen?
Well, I could start. I could also start by just thanking Ture actually for enabling me to be here in Arizona, because he's been looking after the master students that we're teaching. And and also thank you, Mirka, for the invitation. But I've particularly liked the 3 questions that you've posed to us. And so what I've done is I put something in writing under each of those questions. So maybe I could just start with that, because there's so much to say that I don't want to lose my thread. And I thought, let me just start, and then you can just stop me, and then I'll bring in the other stuff. So the first question, how do you practice responsibility as a post-qual scholar? And I thought probably that issues of access are really important for me, because the philosophical shift, the post-qual shift, is philosophically very complex. And people have already been saying a little bit, and also in the introductions, about the need to think relationality differently between the world and us, and the human and the more than human. So as an educator, what is my responsibility to be, educate that? So how can I make these complex ideas accessible by not using my authority as a professor or a human or whatever, but by taking students, I suppose, and colleagues and PhD researchers on a journey? And it's a thinking with the other, and also the other than human. And I think the reading groups that I'm involved with are a very important aspect. I always insist that as part of my supervision too, because it is that discontinuous unlearning. It's a constant unlearning of our substance ontology, basically, and it is so much in our language. So we need to do that very slow readings, and slow readings are about really connecting your own practices, your own beliefs with the post-qual literature. So it all goes through questioning rather than just me providing the right answer. So that leads to the second question that you posed. How does responsibility operate in post-qual context in your research? Now, I suppose consistency and integrity are very important concepts for me. So as an educator, I try to enact post-qual philosophy also in my assessment, in my teaching, and and with all the kind of upheaval that brings about for colleagues, but also for students. And I work very much with the notion of responsibility, that very much inspired by Donna Haraway and especially Karen Barad. So I want to say a little bit about responsibility, because it really reconfigures notions such as objectivity, causality, scaling up, apparatuses, and agency. So responsibility is, the way I see it, very much, as I said, inspired by agential realism, which is the post-qual philosophy of Karen Barad. It is, how can I make in my research it's possible for the other to respond? You know, how can I invite, welcome, and enable the response of the other? And that includes the less human and the more than human. So that is the ability to respond. And, you know, how can we do that? Through storytelling, and in particular through asking questions and providing openings for responses from things, animals, the dead, and whole fields of inquiry. And I suppose when I was talking about the complex nature of it, is how can we move away from the idea we've got objects and we've got subjects in space and time to seeing both objects and subjects as phenomena, and tracing those phenomena. So that would also require trans-individual inquiries, and very much important for our earthly survival, actually, and for more just futures. So it has to do with a commitment to undo justices, paying attention to existences that are excluded or included, or we're not aware of their presences, but they're always already there. So this is also a sort of disruption of temporalities as not just linear or not just unilinear, but it's always political. And I think that notion of justice, the justice to come, is an important one, because it's not about something that we project in the future, but it is something that's iterative. It's an always doing in the now, which is never now, but always already entangled with the past and the future. Do I need to say more about this question, other than maybe about the violences? That it's impossible that the responsibility is also positioned in all the decisions that we make as agential cuts, and they always involve including some and excluding some other, and so being responsible for those cuts that you make, which always involve binaries. And I think maybe that's the last thing I want to say is that constantly asking yourself the question, what else is going on when you analyze any kind of data, but in particular, what are the binaries, power-producing binaries, that are already in place when we start research, whether we use certain concepts, and just taking those concepts, walking around in those concepts and think, how can we think about these concepts like the human or animal differently? So I probably have said more than 5 minutes, have I?
You're good.
Okay.
Yes, that's perfect.
I can say a bit more about the third question, but maybe just wait for that one.
Why don't you just wait for a second and we get to Franz and Ture, and then we'll return to the third question. We can post that as maybe a startup for a dialogue.
Okay, lovely.
Yeah, thanks so much, Karen. Franz, Ture, who wants to go?
I can have a go. Ture, is it good? Thanks. So in responding to those questions, I responded more to sort of the feeling I had about them than the actual questions, I guess. So I just sort of wrote down a few ideas. So and what came up in thinking about what's responsibility in post-qual research, and I struggle. I must be honest. I struggle with the idea of post-qualitative research. I don't necessarily always cast my work as within that, although I'm very much inspired by many of the people that write within that tradition. So I sort of had to work out for myself, but what is post-qual and what would that mean for my responsibility in doing it, engaging in it? So in considering the responsibility, I then start from a position that post-qualitative research is about rethinking thinking, how we come knowledgeable about, with, and in the world, but also about how we choose to live, our becoming. So very simply put, it is for me about experimenting with the possibilities of what research might become when being, knowledge, values, ethics are all understood as entangled and inseparable. So if one goes along with such an understanding, it means also that we have to let go of this idea that existence is an individual affair. So we really have to start ourselves. Well, if this is the case, and I want to quote Patty Lauder and Elizabeth St. Pierre, is they ask this question, is how might we think research in the implication of an agentic assemblage of diverse elements that are constantly interacting, never stable, never the same. So this rethinking of thinking would necessarily bring in a sharp focus to the question of practicing responsibility. If knowledge is not generated by humans alone, but rather arise as a consequence, as Karen Barat puts it, the world making itself intelligible to another part. So in thinking to sort of wrap my head around that, there's really three things that come up for me and that I find important. And those are the question around immanent ethics in research, this idea of dwelling, which I'll talk a bit about, and then the attention that one has to pay in the act of dwelling. So starting with an immanent ethics, for Deleuze, and I'm using his ideas around immanent ethics, ethics can be understood as the facilitative rules that evaluate what we do, we say, and we think according to our immanent modes of existence. Ethics then is about how we respond to the immanent relations in which we find ourselves. Specifically, taking up an immanent ethics is about considering the effective relations of bodies in a collective and how these relations might enhance or decrease the powers of acting among these different bodies. So for me, this means that in post-qualitative research, we need to consider that if all bodies, whether animate or inanimate, have a right to relations that promote their power to act and allow them to flourish, how we can, and again, I'll refer to Barat here, become open and alive to each meeting. Mm-hmm. So how we can use our ability to respond, to echo what Karen just said, and this is really beautifully put by Barat for me, to breathe life into ever new possibilities for living justly. So in thinking about our responsibility then, we need to do so with the awareness that life does not belong to us. All we do is share in a life. So in taking ethics up in this way then, sort of points me in the direction of thinking about research as an act of dwelling with and in the world. So by positioning research as such, what I have in mind is we have to give recognition in our research to how everyday materialities, occurrences, experiences move and change us as the world continuously makes itself intelligible. So the act of dwelling is a relational process of lingering with and in one's environment. But it's also about hesitating as one encounters it, becoming perplexed by it, but also allowing yourself to be led astray by it in a sense. So it is a togetherness with the world that the verb to dwell implies, and that highlights, I believe, the potential of recasting this idea of responsibility in research as really a reaching out towards the world and being receptive to what the world offers us. So research informed by this idea of dwelling for me is really giving recognition to and participating in the world that is always changing, always in between. And this perhaps is where attention comes in for me, because to participate means to attend to one's situation. So when I talk about attention, I'm sort of thinking about the way that Isabel Stengers uses it. So paying attention is about slowing down. It's not about being reflexive. It's not about being critical, but it's really as a means to provoke thinking with. And this is again echoing what Karen just said. So this thinking with then, why do we do it? So we can develop new problems, not necessarily find the answers, but it's by developing these new problems that we can then start to think, but how might we live differently? So attentionality in this way is a very generative practice that goes beyond the cognitive exercise and is really about being an embodied experience and experimentation. So this experimentation then can be directed towards feeling forth different possibilities for how in our togetherness, in our dwelling, we can create new narratives, new stories of life. So just very briefly then to conclude. So for me then, through an enactment of post-qualitative research, or at least how I understand it, I guess, we can then have the opportunity and responsibility to creatively and very importantly, with care, experiment with encountering and relating to the world anew by practicing research that's really premised on a radical openness and attention. And that's sort of how I try to make sense, I guess, of responsibility in thinking about research. Thanks. I hope I didn't go over time.
Thanks so much, Franz. Very intriguing and engaging thoughts you had. We're going to return to them in just a minute. Ture, it's your turn.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karin and Franz. Very thought-provocative and quite entangling with my thinking and thoughts as well. I today scribbled some thoughts down and thought that it would be best to read them. So I'm going to enter with my artistic practices this time. Often I start with the academic practices and theories, but this is also kind of something that some of you might find familiar. I start by a quote by jazz percussionist Milford Graves in an interview with Bahei Tatematsu in 1993, which goes like this: "Free musician does not mean you do anything you want to do. It simply means the capability or sensibility to be able to respond to the environment you are in and make a music according to the environment that you are in." To me, Graves suggests so that music is never only music, that there are other things at play too, and the questions of responding is actually a multisensory one and situated and an open and ongoing question. It is as if the musician is more like a critical sensorium through which material discursive forces flow, grow, diminish. It's quite challenging to resonate like this. I practice free improvisation and it's quite challenging practice, but it's nevertheless very, very important to rehearse these kind of modes of immersion and attentiveness. A similar practice is engaged when we write fragmented, partial, open-ended, yet still magical, haunting, troubling, mattering stories with my colleagues, Riikka Hohti in particular, at an educational zoo that is built inside a secondary school's atrium, where young people act as caretakers for the animals and plants that live in this atrium. Ethics is not a tick in a box and signature below kind of thing, but more about an encounter and the grappling with possibilities and impossibilities, but the absolute necessity to respond. The question of responding in this particular place, this greenhouse, this educational zoo, also needs to be asked in relation to structures of the school and educational system, its temporalities, hierarchies, and erased histories, keeping in mind that these are not the only stories that can be told. So when we are visiting this place, this greenhouse, we feel that we are joining a stream of stories and bodies in mutation. We are joining a compost. We're joining something that is brewing. We like to think ourselves more as visitors rather than master storytellers, thus connecting with those of our ancestors who saw it important to continuously ask for permission from the forest and its forces when they were visiting the forest, and in which they were seeking to become nourished. And when we do get nourished, how can we give back? Then I wrote a bit about some problematics that I feel quite difficult when we do empirical philosophical work in post-qualitative research, such as the universities, how they have in the past few decades become increasingly obsessed with economical technological applicability of research, innovation and problem solving, rankings made by consults, globally attractive profiles and missions. For the field of education, this has meant an increasing pressure to measure learning outcomes, for instance. At the same time, the public trust on research has decreased partly due to its perceived inability to produce certainty at the face of complexity. Environmental crisis, for example. On the political domain, we are witnessing an increasing polarization and acceleration of either or logic too. So this is kind of some of the context in which our post-qualitative research is situated in, and that requires response to. One of my inspirations come from multi-species studies, which I feel very warmly about, where the inquiry seeks to attend and attune to the ways in which specific situated bodies are shaping and being shaped by various forces, such as economical, political, ecological, technological, chemical, energetic. To me, this kind of work is very difficult, like improvisation in jazz music or free improvisation. It's impossible to degree, but I think it's an exercise through which, at the end of the day, we can come to know and care a bit differently and become passionately immersed and cultivate arts of attentiveness, like the multi-species scholars say. Perhaps also acknowledging that at the same time areas of imperceptibility are produced too. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ture. Very thoughtful and thought-provoking thoughts you had. Also, oh my God, I'm overwhelmed. I don't even know where to start. So many, just beautiful things. Radical openness, motive attentiveness, trans individual inquiry, visitors in our educational zoos and forests, and chemical forces shaping our lives and our coexistence with more than human partners, the act of dwelling, very generative space. So, Karen?
Can I just make a suggestion? Very much taken by both of you. Thank you, Ture and Frans. But I was just wondering about the kind of meeting that this is, and our responsibility in this meeting, and Frans saying about the concept of meeting. And if we stay with that, I wonder whether all of us in this Zoom room can meet maybe in a different way by also opening up their cameras. I mean, some of you might be in bed and you prefer not to, I fully understand, but maybe some of you would like to open up so that it's a meeting of a different kind. Thank you. And that kind of informality we also very much try to do with our students. Doesn't matter if you want to get up or eat or, well, I suppose there are limits, but we can discuss that when for some, maybe that is a problem, but that is wonderful. Thank you.
So all the presenters, and Karen too, do you want to return to that question of collective responsibility, or was there something else from each other's opening remarks that you would like to address?
I suppose what comes to what extent a responsibility, which I think all three of us have been talking about, that ability to respond, and very much taken also by the kind of modesty. And when you were talking about the giving back, that kind of responsibility in those meetings. And I think for me, the concept of family or kin, as some of our colleagues, of course, talk about, but family who belongs in the family. So when we talk about collective, rather than thinking, how can we as individuals come together and be responsible together in that way, is really reconfigure some of these key concepts. And family is one of them, and I think that's also very much provoked by responses that we found, and Ture and I have been talking about that quite a bit, to COVID, and as outside or inside, but also how nations have responded and how families are responding. So that kind of thought about what actually do we mean by community, what do we actually mean by collective. It's I suppose the troubling of the concept of collective in the question itself, and I very much like what Karen Barad talks about, and also another colleague of mine called Walter Cohen. He talks about how can we teach in ways and think in ways and be in ways together that we create worlds that are a bit more easy to love. And I think the concept of love is a very important one. And then just sort of finish with the kind of the diffractive methodology, which is critical, but it's not critical in the sense that it is but that it's affirmative in the sense of doing justice to the way in which ideas and theories are always already in relation with one another, and doing justice to those entangled relationalities, which I think connects beautifully to his concern about universities and their place in the political landscape, and our responsibilities as academics, whether we see ourselves as post-qual researchers or not. What's happening there. Yeah, so that is just a comment.
Yeah, I mean, like in the work that I do, I like to kind of think in, well, how Bruno Latour describes Vincent Despert's work in what would animals do if we ask the right questions. He describes this as an additive empirist work instead of subtractive empirist work. So I'm thinking that for example, in this is it anti-science or is it anti-research, landscape where we cannot provide certainty because we are dealing with questions and phenomena where we want to add versions and keep in movement. So how does these kind of these communities or these publics, how can they encounter? How can, I don't know.
And also, to what extent the encounter can be different, following on from your start with music. And maybe an example also helps in terms of thinking of collective. So last year, when Tu and I were teaching this class, they were involved and also the contemplating questions Cascade. And there was an encounter from a DVD clip, which is, it's actually, I write about this in the book that Mirka was mentioning in the last chapter. Because it was just so powerful how our students were responding through asking questions about this encounter between a child and a fish in an aquarium. And then we sort of provoked the students not to ask questions, not just from the perspective of the child, but also from the fish, but then also from the glass, in between the fish and the... So we had this cascading questions, which was fascinating. And then we saw a kind of activity on the internet where, I think somewhere in Australia, where for 24 hours, people were coming together in the park, but of course we couldn't do that because of COVID. And then they need to keep together. So there's this collective, a sound going all the way through. So we invited them to watch this video of this encounter of the fish and the child, which is a clip from Karen Malone in a special issue on videography and decolonizing childhood. And to stay with it, I think the staying with is a very important one, and let the questions kind of emerge, and also express that in sound, and then try to keep it going. And what we found was that actually, because they didn't have to have their cameras on, they could take the cameras off, but then to keep the sound going without stopping, and just give expression, articulate how it affected them. And so we first of all did it once, it didn't work that well, and then we did it again. And then it was, maybe you can say a bit to what you did to the sound. And I've got it as a QR code in the book. But it was just absolutely incredible how working with the other languages, very much inspired by Reggio Emilia, the other languages really help to express and other ways of that meeting, collective meeting of ideas. But maybe you want to say a bit about that, Ture.
Do I?
I don't know.
Yeah. My thoughts started to wander on a different topic.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
On a collective. You were talking about the collective, and I was thinking of an old Finnish word from this area where I live and from which I where my old Finnish word called väki, which means that in everything in a world there is väki. There is another word for it is haltia, but in everything there is väki, and väki means both people. So in everything there are people. There is a people in everything. And it also means force. So force is in everything. So this kind of collective, like if we feel that some notion has been taken over by other discourses, we can always kind of relearn old words for collectives. Väki, people, and force.
I really like that, and it sort of, for me again, it points to this idea that force, life, whatever, it's always bigger. It's always more than us, and it's a collective in a way. It's a shared experience. And that sharing, I think, is something that is really important. But what I really is a sentence that stuck in my mind when you spoke to it is this idea of there's always something that is brewing, and within that collective, there's always something brewing in a collective, and I think very often, or perhaps in my orientation, because there's such a focus on affirming and affirmative research, very often it's something else that you mentioned. In this brewing, we always sort of try to affirm, but we also need to sort of make ourselves open, this radical openness to the hauntings and the erasures that form part of being part of a collective in a sense. And whilst not sort of losing sight of this again, the affirmation, but this, enhancing of powers to act in the collective. That response was all over, right? But it's really just some of the things that you said that sort of stuck with me. But this idea of force is really quite nice, the vitality, in a sense, of life.
Thank you, everybody, for your responses. Let's open now the conversation to the audience too. Do you want to add, respond, have any questions, wonderings? In the chat, there's a question about collective authorship. Anybody wants to share tips or experiences related to that?
If I can very briefly, just because it's something that's been sort of playing on my mind as well. If we truly say that what we do is sort of a with, always with others, then how do we give expression to that withness in something like authorship? And it's very problematic, and it speaks to this what was mentioned earlier about how do this fit into the bigger governmentalities and around new liberal institutions that we work in. it's a very difficult question, and I don't know. I have not figured it. You know, I don't know. I must be honest. I don't know, and it bothers me. It really does bother me. How do we escape this? Can we escape this? How do we sort of push against this? I don't know. I would really like to hear what other people think.
Yeah, I remember one article, I just can't recall its name, but in that one, there was the woods in which it was done was marked as one of the authors. I think it was a nice gesture towards this sort of collective marking. Like, I don't know if it helps, but if we think of each author as an assemblage already, it's quite difficult to kind of start to struggle with this tradition. It's rooted in not only in academia but in the arts, in anywhere where you write CVs. But if you consider it as an assemblage, and when you read a research article, you realize that it really is an assemblage, an entanglement. I don't know if this helps. It's always collective work that we do. It just has a name on it, and I can tell you that the birds in my yard don't call me Tore. So they have different names. But it's a tricky, good question.
I like your idea. I mean, you never write on your own. And I think the preface to Meeting the Universe Halfway by Karen Barat is incredibly inspiring in terms of acknowledging the relations that you're already part of, and very much as part of a feminist practice as well. So I can highly recommend that as a way of sort of acknowledging where our ideas come from, not as something in the past, but always already entangled. And in a recent writing with colleagues in a book called Glossary from this Postqual book series, there we call it our first chapter, as it introduces writing together apart, which is a play on cutting together apart, as something that even when you make an agential cut, that is always already part of the relation, and actually strengthens the relation. And one of the kind of the ethical things to do as a researcher or as an author is always a returning to previous work. Because these stories and returning to our stories helps to thicken them, and it is a kind of complexifying our descriptions of the world. And I think that's what I particularly like about agential realism, is that it is, as a post-qualitative approach, philosophy, is that it is doing more justice to what else is going on, which is, I suppose, related to the kind of next question. But just to say about, in terms of authorship, you know, there are lots. We also have to be very strategic and practical as academics, and I think, you know, we can't change the world in it. And I like that also for agential realism, or the way we think about justice to come is that it's not like, oh, these big narratives, utopian narratives that are in the future, but it is about every move, every thought, and the responsibility for those. And you know, as what Franz was saying about it, is each is a meeting with this table, a meeting with my computer, a meeting with myself, whatever that means. So it is that iterativeness that is also reminds quite a few people of Taoism and Buddhism. It's not something that we can impose on others or should be doing for others, or but it is something that it's not just a way of doing research, but it's a way of life. And so it does haunt. It haunts. Every moment is already threaded through with the futures that are always already there too, and the past, which is never closed. And so it's always a returning to the past too, that is never sort of finished in different ways. And yeah. So I don't know whether I should say more about that. And it is that hauntology, so moving away from ontology as something that is, although is in Sanskrit actually is also about breathing. It's about becoming rather than is, how we have started to use it in at least Western philosophies a lot, but within Western philosophies also lots of troubling. So I'm also troubled about West, East, North, South, because these abstractions are also simplistic. And Haraway writes beautifully about that too. So to stay much more with the situated knowledge making, which I think, you know, Bharat writes very interestingly about how that is often misunderstood as not something that's local, and but it's that it is. I mean, you can also be situated in this machine as we are now. But Bharat talks about topological manifolds, which is also where space and time are already unfolded in that now that haunts, right? And the there that haunts. And so in research, it is the invitation to explore not just what's there, but also what is not there. And it is that kind of, I love what you were saying, Tour, about this art of attentiveness. So that what is it we need to pay attention to, which is also not there, and it is there too.
Franz,
yeah,
Franz, go ahead.
Yeah. If I could, I must say, in thinking about the hauntings of justice, I mean, justice in itself is quite it's potentially a very problematic idea to think about in terms of whose justice is, who enforces these justices. I mean, it's a complex thing to think about, but I still think it's something that we should, you know, grapple with constantly in our research and through our research, just because what we do have ontological effects and ethical implications and consequences. Because we are so much part and embedded in the world. But for me, I must say, I in a sense, I try and keep it very simple, think about it very simplistically myself, and that the notions of what should I or what could I do, not what should I do, that's important. What could I do? It's very much informed by Spinoza's understanding of effect and how what we do affects the things around us in different ways. It either sort of enhances powers, or it decreases it, or it decomposes it even. Now, so every encounter we get into, it's to consider those effects and what they produce, but not only in the encounter, but also how that encounter connects up with sort of larger systems. So it's a scalability thing as well. But it's taking, so it's really being attentive, that word comes back, but also just for me at least, taking care in I think thinking and doing research. And then really, but this idea of justice, it's something that's really important personally to me in my research as well, but it's something that I at the same time recognize it's a very complex idea. I experience it as a very complex idea.
Tilra, go ahead.
I started to think about we're running out of time, are we?
We want to hear from you before we run out of time. So please conclude your thinking.
I try to connect with these ideas and take you for a while to the educational zoo, the greenhouse. It's maintained with all sort of technologies in Finland, and we visited there when it was minus 25 degrees outside, and indoors where we got there, it's a subtropical climate with air conditioners, humidifiers, and so on. The animals that are there are a lot of different animals, a lot of different plants, bigger like pet animals, and also fruit flies and ants and a lot of different animals. I'm not going to that yet, but we were thinking about this idea, this question of justice. Given that they are pets, they have been taken from their natural environments at some point of history due to some historical developments, some discursive practices, some like things like, for example, the gerbils that were there are thought to descend from 20 gerbils that were captured in, I think it was in Mongolia, perhaps in 1950s, for research use, to be used in the US as research animals, as lab animals. And from there, somehow, the gerbils became popular pets, and they were now at the greenhouse. But when the kids were there, they came to the upper elementary school. They started their 7th grade, and then got attracted, got interested. Something interested them. Some of them fall in love with the gerbil or some other animal, and they started to train how to take care of this particular animal. So they met there, and their concerns were the daily concerns of matters of living and dying. How to work in this relationship so that we can live together, we can get on. So it kind of, we were many times thinking about these ways through which these histories, these kind of trajectories of specific animals, for example, the iguan, were being erased, not being talked about. Nobody know anything about how this iguan came there. It just was there. And because it just was there, it posed the question of how to care. So this is kind of a lot of different layers to the question, what is ethical and what is just. It kind of, they all come together and they all exist in these occasions when the kids are preparing the food for their cared animal, and then when they are trying to figure out if it's stressed or not, and what might have concerned it, and things like that. Just an opening to our multi-species ethnography at the greenhouse and the complexity of stuff, really.
Just a quick comment. I think what is fascinating there is how the questions move from questions about truth to questions about justice. So even although it might be very difficult to answer, is that also engaging with those kind of questions in education, and how unusual that is, because we tend to think in terms of truth when we talk about questions in education. So yes, such important work. Yeah.
And perhaps questions about care too, like non-innocent care and not unproblematic care work.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We are out of time, and I want to respect your need to do and attend to other relations. So thank you so much, our presenters. It was lovely to learn with you and be here this morning. Thank you, organizers, and Iveta and Anne, and all of you participants who were part of our relations this morning. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You want to shut down the Zoom, Anne?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and shut it down. And see you soon.
Yeah, bye, Ture. See you soon.
Thank
Bye,
you so
Karin.
much, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Let's catch up soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, we'll do. Bye.